The spoon never made it to his mouth. Elias Cord had lived 43 years on this earth, and he had learned, through broken ribs, frozen winters, and the particular silence that follows a gunshot, that a man's instincts were worth more than any rifle he could carry. So when the hairs along the back of his neck rose like grass before a storm, he set the spoon down on the table with the kind of careful deliberateness that a man uses when he doesn't want to make a sound. The stew steamed, the fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines the way it always did in October, restless and low, like something breathing against the walls of the cabin. He had built this place alone, log by log, over one long summer, and he knew every sound it made. He knew which board groaned underfoot. He knew the particular knock the shutter made when the north wind found it. He knew the difference between a branch scraping the roof and something else. This was something else. He didn't reach for the rifle right away. That was the instinct of a young man, quick hands and a loud heart. He had learned patience the hard way. Instead, he turned his eyes slowly toward the single window cut into the eastern wall, its oilskin cover letting the faintest orange thread of firelight through to the dark outside. Nothing. The glass, real glass, hauled up the mountain on a mule's back 3 years ago, caught nothing but pine shadow and black sky. Then the sound came again. Not a branch. Not the wind. Not an animal, though God knew the mountain had enough of those. It was the sound of weight, deliberate, cautious, two-legged weight, moving along the far side of the cabin wall, moving slow, moving like it didn't want to be heard. Elias rose from the table. He was a large man, not in the way of men who carry fat or bluster. He was large the way old timber is large, dense and weathered and difficult to move against. His hands were wide as shovels, calloused to leather, and his face was the face of a man who had spent decades being carved by wind and altitude rather than shaped by warmth, a long beard, dark, threaded with silver. Eyes the particular grey of river stone, still and deep. He moved through the cabin without a sound, a skill that should not have belonged to a man his size, but did. He took the rifle from its hook beside the door. He pressed himself flat against the wall beside the frame and listened. Silence. Then breathing. Shallow, ragged, not quite right. The kind of breathing that belonged to someone trying very hard not to make a sound but failing at it, because the body was winning the argument against the mind. Elias closed his eyes for 3 seconds. He had heard that sound before. He had heard it in the war, in the years after, in the hills and gulches of a dozen territories where men went when the world below had no more use for them. That was the breathing of a person in pain. He opened the door. The cold rushed in first, sharp and pine-edged October cold, the kind that had teeth in it. The firelight spilled out across the narrow porch and caught in its amber reach the figure slumped against the outside wall of his cabin. Small, too small, hunched into itself with both arms crossed over its chest, wearing a coat 2 sizes too large, the collar pulled up over the jaw, a hat pulled low, steam rising from labored breath in the cold air. He raised the rifle. The figure looked up. Whatever Elias Cord had expected to see in the firelight of this lonely mountain night, outlaw, wanderer, desperate man with hollow eyes and a knife, he had not expected this. The face beneath the hat's brim was young. Younger than any face had a right to be this far up the mountain, this far from anywhere, A boy, maybe 16, maybe younger, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that held his gaze without flinching, even as the body beneath those eyes shook with something that was either cold or pain or both. And across the front of the oversized coat, spreading dark and slow through the fabric, was blood. Not old blood, fresh. Elias stood in the doorway with the rifle leveled and the cold moving around him and the fire's warmth at his back, and he looked at the boy for a long moment. The boy looked back at him. Neither spoke. The wind moved through the pines. Then the boy's dark eyes, still steady, still proud, even as his teeth had begun to chatter, cut away from Elias's face and dropped to the ground. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but in the language of men who lived far from comfort and diplomacy, it was everything. It was the only surrender that kind of pride would allow. It said, "I cannot go any further." Elias held the rifle a moment longer. He thought about the 3 days' ride to the nearest town. He thought about the last time he had let himself become involved in someone else's trouble and what that trouble had cost him. He thought about the particular mathematics of a mountain winter. How many miles of snow, how many dead horses, how many frozen trails stood between this cabin and any other human soul. Then he thought about the blood. "Can you walk?" he said. His voice came out rough from disuse. He hadn't spoken aloud in 11 days. The boy raised his chin. "Yes," he said. The word was clipped, proud, and entirely unconvincing because even as he said it, he pressed his back harder against the cabin wall, as if the wall was the only thing keeping him vertical. Elias lowered the rifle. He stepped onto the porch. He reached down and took the boy's arm across his shoulders, and he pulled him upright, and he felt, through the coat, through the shirt beneath, through the layers of cold fabric, the particular shape of a wound he recognized from a very long time ago. He had been shot with the same kind of arrow once. He got the boy inside and shut the door, and for the first time in 11 days, the cabin did not feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something he was not prepared for. Something that would reach down into the buried past of Elias Cord and pull up everything he had spent years covering over. He just didn't know it yet. The boy passed out before Elias could get him fully onto the cot. He caught him, barely, one thick arm sweeping around the narrow chest before the kid's legs buckled entirely, and he lowered him down with a care that surprised even himself. He hadn't been careful with anything in a long time. Careful was a habit that required something worth protecting. He cut the coat away with his hunting knife. Underneath was a story. The wound was in the left side, just below the ribs. Not an arrow after all, but a knife, and not a recent one, though it had been reopened. Someone had already stitched it, badly, with what looked like sinew or rough thread, and the sutures had torn through the flesh when the boy had pushed his body past what the body was willing to give. The wound was deep, but not mortal, not yet, not if it was cleaned and bound and kept from infection. But infection was already moving. The skin around the wound was hot and swollen in a way that told Elias the boy had been running for at least 2 days on a festering cut. He worked without speaking. He heated water. He used the whiskey he kept for the same purpose. Whiskey had always been kept on a mountain, not drinking, but surviving. He cleaned the wound while the boy lay unconscious, and he watched the young face flinch and tighten even in the absence of awareness, the body recoiling from pain it couldn't think its way past. He restitched what needed restitching. He bandaged it tight with strips of linen. He covered the boy with the heavier of his 2 blankets, and he pulled his chair to the opposite side of the cabin, and he sat. And he looked, not at the wound, at the boy himself. The hat had come off in the struggle to get him down. The face that lay against the pillow now was, with the coat gone and the coat's disguise gone with it, clearly not a boy's, not entirely. The jaw was sharp, but not hard. The hands, folded loosely against the blanket, were narrow. There was a braid, partially unravelled, dark hair that had been wound up beneath the hat with deliberate concealment. The boy, the young person, was perhaps 17, perhaps 18, and had been riding a long time as something other than what they were. Ilias looked at the ceiling. He was not a man given to complicated thoughts about the nature of people. He had lived his life by a simple and unsentimental code. What a person did mattered more than what a person was. He had known good men who looked like criminals and criminals who looked like deacons, and the frontier had a long tradition of people arriving as someone new. He didn't ask, he didn't judge. But he was a practical man, and practicality required an honest accounting. He was alone on a mountain with a stranger who was hiding something, who had arrived on his doorstep in the middle of the night with a reopened wound and a dead man's coat, and who had clearly run from somewhere rather than toward anywhere. He could wait for morning, see if the stranger woke and offered an explanation, or he could do what the safer version of himself would have done 11 days ago before the cabin started to feel like a tomb. He could put the stranger back on whatever horse or trail had delivered them, point them down the mountain, and go back to his stew. He looked at the fire. He looked at the wound dressing, already showing the faintest blush of pink through the linen. He went to bed. He was awake before dawn, the way he always was, and the stranger was awake before him. They were sitting up on the cot. The blanket was held up around the shoulders with both hands, and they were watching him with those dark eyes from across the cabin. Watchful, calculating, preparing some story or some silence. He could see the decision happening behind their face. They were choosing what version of themselves to present to him. He saved them the trouble. "I don't need to know," he said, and started building the fire back up. Silence. "What?" The voice was low. "Careful. Whatever story you're working on," Ilias said, setting a log on the coals. "I don't need it. You need rest and food and another 2 days before that wound closes proper. That's all I know." More silence. He could feel the stranger recalibrating. "You don't want to know who I am?" "I know you're hurt," Ilias said. "That's enough." A pause, so long that the fire had time to catch and breathe. Then, "My name is Calla." He nodded. He didn't repeat it. He just put the pot on. By mid-morning, the situation had changed. He had gone out to check the woodpile, and when he came back, he found Calla standing at the window, standing, which she should not have been doing, looking down the mountain trail with a focus so intense it was nearly audible. "Someone's coming," she said. She didn't look at him. Ilias crossed to the window. Below, where the switchback trail cut through the tree line, a smear of motion. 2 horses, moving fast, In her silence before the words came in. Her silence before the words came. "They're looking for me." "What did you do?" She turned and looked at him then, the full weight of those dark eyes direct and undefended, and said something he had not expected. Nothing that wasn't already being done to me first. He looked at her. He looked at the wound. He looked back at the riders. He had 11 seconds roughly before they would clear the tree line and see the cabin smoke. He said, "Get in the back room. Don't make a sound." She hesitated, the proud hesitation of someone who had survived by trusting no one. And then she went. Elias picked up his rifle and stepped out onto the porch. He leaned against the post and waited, the way a man waits who owns the land he's standing on and has no intention of moving from it, and he watched the two riders come up the trail with the calm attention of a man who had long since run out of things to fear. But beneath that calm, his pulse moved fast. Because he had recognized one of the horses. The horse was a blue roan with a white sock on the left foreleg, and Elias had last seen it 3 years ago, tied to a post outside a courthouse in a town called Merciful, Colorado, while the man who rode it walked inside and lied under oath about a killing that cost another man his land. His land. He kept his face still. The two riders came up the last stretch of trail and pulled their horses to a stop in the clearing before the cabin. Both men were armed in the practiced, visible way of men who wanted you to see they were armed. Holsters, riding high and easy, rifles in the scabbards but loose. The first was a stranger, broad, red-faced, with the look of a man hired for his size rather than his judgment. The second was older, thinner, with a moustache grown carefully over a mouth that did not smile. Elias knew that mouth, Deputy Harlan Crook, 3 years older and not improved by the passage of time. "Cord," Crook said. He said it the way a man says the name of a debt. "Crook," Elias said. "Funny thing running into you out here." "Not that funny. I live here." Crook's eyes moved over the cabin, the woodpile, the porch, the single window, cataloguing, calculating. "We're tracking a fugitive," he said. "Young, dark-haired, goes by more than one name, wanted for theft out of the Durango territory." He paused. "And some other things." "Haven't seen anyone," Elias said. Crook looked at him for a long time. The red-faced man said nothing, but his hand rested close to his holster. "Mind if we look around?" "I mind it quite a bit," Elias said, and there was nothing in his voice but the plain stating of fact. No threat, no elevation, just, "This is how things are. I got a warrant required for that." "We're a long way from warrants up here, Cord." "We're a long way from a lot of things," Elias agreed, "including witnesses." He let that sit. He watched Crook's eyes recalibrate. "Now you can come down off those horses and step inside, and I'll tell you the same thing I just told you. I haven't seen anyone. Or you can ride back down the mountain and look somewhere you haven't looked yet. But you're not searching my cabin without paper that says you can." The red-faced man shifted in his saddle. "Harlan," he said. One word, a warning going both directions. Crook's jaw moved. His eyes stayed on Elias, reading him, looking for the crack. He didn't find one. "Theft is one thing," Crook said, his voice dropping to something more intimate and therefore more dangerous. "But I told you there were other things. This fugitive killed a man, Cord. Shot him in the back at a trading post outside Durango, left him dead in the dirt. He let the weight of that settle. Now, if you're hiding a killer, that makes you something too. Elias said nothing. A man alone up here, Crook continued, something shifting in the air between them. With a hard winter coming, it gets dangerous. Things happen, fires, accidents. His eyes drifted to the cabin roof, and the insinuation was as plain as if he'd spoken it outright. Be a shame. Elias looked at the roof. Then he looked back at Crook. I remember, Elias said quietly. When you stood up in a courthouse and told Judge Pryor you never saw a deed, signed document. My father's handwriting. He paused. You remember that? Crook's face did something complicated. That's got nothing to do with, I'm not finished. Elias's voice didn't rise. He didn't need to. I lost that land because of your testimony, and I came up this mountain because I was done with men like you and the things they do in the service of men with money. I have made my peace with that, but if you threaten my home again, from any direction, I will remind you and everyone else down in whatever town you're calling home that there's a very particular kind of man who stands up in court and commits perjury. He looked at the red-faced man. And the men who ride with him? Silence opened up like a pit between them. The wind moved through the pines. Crook gathered his reins. We'll be back with paper, he said. And his voice had lost the intimacy. It was flat now, official. The voice of a man resetting. I'll be here, Elias said. He watched them ride back down the trail until the pines swallowed them, and then he stood on the porch for another full minute, absolutely still, listening to the mountain. Then he went inside. Calla was not in the back room. She was standing in the middle of the cabin, upright, pale, pressing one hand against her bandaged side, and she had clearly heard every word. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. That man, Crook, he'll come back. I know that too. And when he does, he'll have paper. Or he won't, but he'll come with enough men that paper won't matter. She was looking at him with something between gratitude and fury. The expression of someone who has never been defended and doesn't entirely know how to hold it. You've made yourself a target. Elias crossed to the fire and picked up the pot. Sit down before you fall down, he said. She didn't sit. They said I killed someone. He poured 2 cups. He carried them to the table. He put one across from his chair and he sat down. Did you? He said. The word hit the room and hung there in the silence and the firelight. She came to the table. She sat across from him. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked into it, and for a long moment the only sound was the fire and the wind and the faraway diminishing beat of 2 horses going back down the mountain. Then she looked up. Yes, she said. Elias took a slow breath. Then, he said, I think you'd better tell me everything. She talked for a long time, not easily. Nothing about it was easy, but steadily, with the flat, careful tone of a person who has decided that the truth is less dangerous than the silence it's been stored in. Elias listened without interrupting, which was a skill he had, one of the few he was proud of. He had learned it from a Ute elder once, years back, before the world had managed to scatter everything he knew. Learned that listening was an act of respect, and that most people would tell you everything if you simply declined to fill their pauses with yourself. Calla had grown up in the Durango Territory, daughter of a Tejano horse trader and a Jicarilla Apache woman in the particular seam between worlds that belonged fully to neither. Her father had died when she was 12. Her mother 2 years after. She had lived by working, ranches, trading posts, laundries, moving constantly because staying still had always eventually presented a version of the same problem. Men who believed that a young woman alone was an invitation. The man in Durango was named Forsyth. He owned the trading post where she worked. He had been for a year the particular kind of generous that is not generosity, the calculated, transactional generosity of a man building a debt in someone else's name without their knowledge. And when he presented his invoice, she had said no, and he had not accepted that. He had friends, she said without emotion. Crook was one of them. There were others, town men, men with names. She looked at her cup. When I ran, I took his horse. That was the theft. A pause. When he came after me and put a knife in my side, I took it back. Another pause, shorter. He didn't survive that. Elias said nothing. Self-defense is a story for people with witnesses, she said, and her voice, for the first time, fractured very slightly along a line of something old and enormous, something she had been carrying so long, its weight had become indistinguishable from her own bones. I had none. Crook's name on a testimony is worth more than my word in any court between here and Texas. Elias looked at the fire. He thought about a courthouse. He thought about a deed. He thought about the difference between what the law was and what the law did. I'm not going to pretend the world is fair, he said at last. I know it's not. But I want you to know something. He looked at her directly. I believe you. She looked at him with those level dark eyes, and he watched something shift in them. Not dramatically, not the collapse of a wall, but the small, almost imperceptible settling of a weight. 3 words. I believe you. He suspected no one had said them to her about anything that mattered in a very long time. He stood and went to the shelf above the hearth. He took down a small tin box, the kind that once held tobacco, and he brought it to the table and set it between them. I want to show you something, he said. He opened the box. Inside, resting on a folded piece of cloth, was a photograph. Yellowed at the edges, cracked across one corner, but clear enough. A family in front of a farmhouse. The farmhouse Elias had been born in, low and wide on flat Colorado land. His father, solid and square. His mother standing very straight. A young Elias, barely recognizable, just a serious-faced boy standing beside his father's arm. This was my family's land, he said. 400 acres, deeded to my father in 1861. He built everything on it himself. When he died, it passed to me. He touched the edge of the photograph with one finger. 3 years ago, Crook testified in court that the deed was a forgery. Man named Alcott wanted the land. He had money and connections have always been worth more than paper, especially when someone's willing to stand up and lie. He looked at the photograph a moment longer, then closed the box. I lost the farm. I came up here. He set the tin box between them on the table. Calla looked at it, then at him. He ruined you too, she said. He helped, Elias agreed. She reached out and touched the tin box with 2 fingers, not opening it, just touching it, the way you touch something that has weight without trying to lift it. Then she reached into the inside pocket of the too large coat, still hanging over the cot, and she took out something small and held it across the table to him. It was a ring, plain silver, small, a woman's ring, worn smooth on the inside. "My mother's," she said. "The only thing I have left of her. I've carried it since she died." She set it on the table between them beside his tin box. "She used to say that the only thing you own on this earth is your name and what you do with it. Every judge and deed and deputy can take everything else." She looked at the ring. "Forsyth was going to take my name. He was going to make me the kind of person I'm not." "I know," Elias said. "I'm not sorry," she said, and she raised her eyes to meet his, and there was no performance in them, just the plain, unsentimental fact of it. "I've tried to be. I thought it would make me better, but I'm not." Elias looked at her for a long time. "I'm not sure sorry is what's needed," he said. The fire burned low between them. Outside, the wind had shifted, coming from the north now, carrying cold and the sharp promise of the first real snow. The mountains settled around the cabin, heavy and enormous, and in the warm, close space of the firelight, the two of them sat across from each other, with their small relics of lost things on the table between them and the same enemy somewhere below on the mountain trail. For one long moment the danger was very far away. Then from somewhere down the trail, faint but growing, unmistakable, came the sound of hoof-beats, not two horses this time. More. Elias tilted his head, counting. 5, maybe 6. Coming fast. Calla reached for the ring and put it back in her pocket. She looked at him. He looked at her. "How fast can you ride?" he said. There were 6 of them. Elias counted the torches first. 3, maybe 4, bleeding orange through the tree line before the horses cleared it, and then the horses themselves, and then the riders, and he stood on the porch with his rifle and the cold night air, and the sound of Calla saddling his second horse in the lean-to behind the cabin, and he made a very simple calculation. He was one man with a rifle against 6 men with torches. The numbers did not favor him, but numbers, he had learned, were only one part of the arithmetic. Deputy Crook rode at the front. He had brought men from somewhere, not a posse with badges, but the other kind, the kind that a man with Crook's connections could assemble in an afternoon, built from grudges and money rather than law. 2 of them Elias didn't recognize. The third was young, barely past boyhood, and wore the uncomfortable expression of someone who had agreed to something in daylight that looked different in the dark. The 4th and 5th were the hired kind, hard faces, no particular investment in the outcome. The 6th hung slightly back, and Elias recognized him after a moment. Alcott, the man who had taken his farm, older now, heavier, but the same face beneath a beaver felt hat. So that was the shape of it. This wasn't entirely about Calla. This was about 2 debts being settled at once. "Cord?" Crook called out, pulling up at the edge of the torchlight's reach. "We've come for the fugitive, and we're done being polite about it." Elias stood very still. "She's not here," he said. "Then you won't mind us looking." "I told you what I mind, and I told you what would happen." Crook lifted one hand, and the red-faced man from the afternoon separated from the group and rode to the side toward the lean-to. Elias tracked him without moving the rifle, tracking, just tracking, and heard, from the lean-to, the particular silence that told him Calla had heard the rider coming and had stopped moving. He had one chance at this. One. He lowered the rifle. Every man on those horses adjusted, hands moving, weight shifting, the universal recalibration of men who had been prepared for resistance, suddenly presented with something else. "Alcott," Elias said, speaking past Crook to the man at the back. A pause. Alcott moved his horse forward slightly.
"Cord," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who has spent years holding something he's not entirely comfortable holding. "You have my land," Elias said. "I've not disputed it. I've not come after it. I went up a mountain and I built a cabin and I left you alone." He looked at Alcott steadily. "And you have come up here tonight with torches, which means something." Alcott said nothing. "What it means," Elias said, "is that you are still not comfortable. A man who is right in what he has done does not need 6 riders and fire in the middle of the night." He paused. "Crook lied for you in that court, and you know it, and you have been buying his silence ever since. And now he's brought you up a mountain to watch him burn down a one-room cabin and call it justice." He let that sit for a single breath. "Is that the thing you want to be, Alcott?" Silence moved through the group like a tide. Crook turned to Alcott with something rising in his face. "Don't listen to Harlan." Alcott's voice came out older, quieter, and altogether more dangerous than anything Crook had said all evening. "Hold your mouth." Crook's jaw closed. Alcott looked at Elias. He looked at him for a long time, and Elias held the look without flinching, and between them passed something that had no name. The particular communication of 2 men who have both lived long enough to understand what consequences look like when they finally arrive. "The girl," Alcott said.
"What happened in Durango?" "Self-defense," Elias said. "Crook says different." "Crook lies for money," Elias said. "You have personal experience with that." Alcott's jaw moved. He looked at Crook. He looked back at Elias. He reached up and took off his hat and turned it in his hands, and in the torchlight his face was the face of a man performing an uncomfortable interior accounting. "Harlan," he said, "we're going home." The words hit the clearing like stones dropped in still water. "The hell we are," Crook said. "She killed a man." "And the law in Durango can settle it," Alcott said, and his voice carried the finality of a man who has made a business decision. "This isn't our business. You paid me to make it my business. That agreement is over." Crook looked at Elias. His face cycled through several things: fury, calculation, the particular trapped expression of a man whose leverage has just evaporated, and then it settled into something cold and formal. "This isn't done," he said. "It is tonight," Elias said. Crook held his gaze for 5 full seconds. Then he turned his horse. One by one the riders turned. The torches moved back toward the tree line. Alcott paused at the edge of the clearing and looked at Elias one final time, and in his expression was something that Elias had not expected and would not entirely forget, something in the neighborhood of shame. Then he rode into the trees, and the darkness took all of them, and the clearing was quiet again. Elias stood on the porch until the last sound of hoofbeats died entirely. Then he let out a breath that he had been holding since Crook had first ridden into the clearing that afternoon, and his hands, for the first time all night, shook slightly. He heard her come around the side of the cabin. Calla stopped at the edge of the porch. She still had her hand against her side. She looked at the empty trail and then at him. "What did you do?" she said. "Told the truth," he said. "It's riskier than most things. Sometimes it works." She looked at him with those level eyes. "He could have shot you." "He could have," Elias agreed. He went inside and came back with the 2 cups, both warm. He handed her one. Crook needed Alcott to hold the rope. Without Alcott, there was no rope. He wrapped both hands around his own cup. Alcott had been carrying that lie for 3 years. A man carrying a lie for 3 years is tired. I just reminded him how tired he was. Calla looked into her cup. Then she said quietly, "You could have sent me down the mountain this morning, saved yourself all of this." "I could have," he said. "Why didn't you?" He thought about it honestly. Not the answer that sounded right, but the actual answer, the one that lived beneath the quiet of the mountain and the 11 days of silence before her arrival. "Because I was becoming the kind of man that a person can ride past without stopping," he said. "And I didn't want to be that anymore." She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when a thing confirms something they were already almost certain of. They stood on the porch in the cold and drank their coffee and watched the stars, and below them the mountain fell away in darkness toward the distant lights of towns full of men like Crook and women like Calla, and the long, difficult, unresolved business of living. 3 days later the wound had closed well enough to ride. Elias gave her the better of his 2 horses. The bay, steady on mountain trails with a flat, easy gait, and a week's worth of provisions wrapped in oilskin, and the name of a man in New Mexico territory who had once done him a kindness and owed him one in return. She stood at the edge of the clearing with the bay's reins in her hand and looked at him, and he could see her assembling words for something she had not had to say in a long time, and he saved her the trouble. "You don't owe me anything," he said. She considered this. Then she reached into her coat pocket and held something out to him. The ring, her mother's ring. "Not payment," she said before he could speak. "I want you to have it. I want it to be somewhere where someone knows what it meant." She looked at it in his open palm. "She would have liked you." He closed his hand around it. She mounted and rode south, and he watched her go until the pines took her, and then he stood in the clearing for a long while after, the ring warm in his closed fist, the mountain turning its slow, quiet face toward the coming winter. Months later, a letter arrived, carried up the trail by the post rider who made the climb twice a year, with no return address. Inside was a single line in careful, unhurried handwriting. "I found a place. It has a good name. See." Elias read it once, then set it on the shelf beside the tin box with the photograph. He looked at them for a moment. The photograph, the letter, the ring that now sat beside them. And then he went back to work, because the wood didn't split itself and the winter didn't wait. But something in the cabin was different from what it had been. The silence, which had once had the quality of an empty place, now had the quality of a room between visitors. Which is to say, it was patient. Which is to say, it was waiting for the next thing rather than holding the last thing, which for a man like Elias Cord, after everything the years had taken, was more than enough. Outside, the first snow came down through the pines, slow, unhurried, covering every track, every trail, every mark that trouble had left behind, and the mountain, as it always did, kept its long silence and held